And we can review very quickly. China is, as you know, I mean, everyone, it's a very ancient culture. But one of the big issues has to do with how much persists and how much changes. How much persists and how much changes. And usually that which China, what situation it was in sort of when you became an adult, when you first became aware of the world, is often where you sort of remain in your self-consciousness. So my parents' generation, think of Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Mei-ling, his wife, you know, the savior of China, and the Flying Tigers. Does this sound familiar to you? You know, and the Communist Revolution, when we lost China. So that's their remembrance. But an earlier generation, my grandmother's generation, remembers China as a place of terrible famine. Just awful famine. There were terrible famines at the beginning of the 20th century. It was in part because of the falling apart of the government. When the Confucian examination systems ceased to be held in 1909, the usual system by which promising young men were brought into the government that had, previous to this time, created the most stable political structure in the history of the world. You know, even if there were changes in dynasties, by and large, it was very orderly. And so this period in the beginning, in the early 1900s, of this disorder that eventually led into terrible civil war was really unheard of. It was really very hard. The Confucian examination system was eliminated in 1909. Just say that 85% of the land is not farmable. When you look at a map and you see this huge country, right? It's mostly mountainous, and it is not arable land. You have this huge population trying to feed them on 15% farmable land. I mean, it's increasing with various technologies, but still, just so for many generations, you know, famine has been just about that close, right there. And one of the important elements in China has been flood control. There is a history of terrible flooding on the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And so one of the theories, and if you go off with only this little piece of information, I will be very happy, which is that the sinologists, that's the China experts, there's a lot of debate, but there is a very strong feeling that one of the reasons why China has an authoritarian government, has always had an authoritarian government, is because there is desperate need for effective federal flood control. It's because you're in desperate need of it. So anyway, when the government fell apart in the beginning of the 20th century, what happened is that there was terrible famine. And that's where we call it the Great Diaspora. The Great Diaspora, and especially in southern China, like in Canton, Guangdong, that's where, when the great diaspora of Chinese all throughout the world happened, that a lot of the Cantonese went to Cuba, you know, the Caribbean, Mexico. They went anywhere they could go. And a huge number came to the United States, which eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1921. So, you know, the government says, oh, bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, but that's enough. That's enough. No more. No more. And it was simply a Chinese Exclusion Act. They just said, no more Chinese. A paper son is that if you had to be a citizen in order to come into the United States if you were Chinese. And so families in the United States would fake a birth and get the papers. And so that meant that person, that fictive person, you could sell those papers so that somebody could come in from China to the United States. So of course the Chinese Revolution is when? 1948, 49. And then it was the early 50s. By 58, all the missionaries were out. By 58, all the foreign missionaries were out. And except for the YMCA, the foreign mission field, primarily Americans. It started out with the Brits to a great degree, but it ended up being really American endeavor to a great degree. By the time that the Americans left, the success of Christianity in China was so dismal that starting in the 19th century, in the 1830s, when the first missionaries went to China, they went as evangelists and they just went into the marketplaces and would preach. I mean, it was kind of like each one reach one, you know, it was like unfettered, egalitarian in a way, because I've been saved, you can be saved too, that level. But because it didn't take on.
I'm just curious why the YMCA, it sounds like you're saying they were more trusted. Were they more secular, or?
Well, we'll go into it. Anyway, by that time, what happened was eventually that, what are you going to do if your preaching is unsuccessful, and this is a humongous amount of resources? What are you going to do? You eventually say, well, then there must be something wrong with them in not accepting this and not getting it. So we need to elevate them to a higher level of civilization. And when they become more civilized, then they will accept Christianity. So that the huge endeavor of the American missionary enterprise became educational to a great degree. And as I've said before, China, I heard very much so that this was the beginning of education for women in China. The very beginning were the mission schools. It was incredibly important. And I thought there would be a lot more hostility about the mission enterprise, and there is much less than I thought there was. What happened with the YMCAs, the YMCA had a policy. It's, number one, it's not clergy dominated. Okay? So it's a lay movement. The YMCA is a lay movement. Throughout the world, the YMCA historically was a Christian organization. It had a strong missionary element. It's not just the health club that we think of today. This was an international movement, lay-led, to evangelize the world. And they had a policy that you could only be a missionary for 5 years. In fact, that's what the Peace Corps used as its model. You can only be like an administrator of the Peace Corps for 5 years max. I have a friend who was the medical director of the Peace Corps, and he had 5 kids. He lived in D.C. And at the end of 5 years, he had to leave. There was no letting up on that. And they had a policy that they had to therefore recruit indigenous leadership. So they recruited local people from the very beginning, knowing that they were leaving. And with that was the beginning. In fact, during the difficult days after the revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, what's called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, which was the little remnant of the church that was able to maintain, has very strong, the rhetoric and stuff sounds very much like the YMCA, because those were the indigenous leadership that were developed. And so that was hugely important. More effective. Because what happened is that these foreign missionary enclaves developed, because you're in such a hostile environment, and the people are so strange. I mean, the Chinese are that is a really different culture. And so, at a certain point, you just can't put up with that. So I read a sociological study